On January 5th, 1923, the predominantly black town of Rosewood, Florida was destroyed by a white mob following a false accusation that a black man had raped a white woman. The mob looted and burned much of the Rosewood community, leaving several black people dead, although numbers varied depending on the source. The destruction of Rosewood was only one in a dark chapter of the post-Civil War United States that saw many newly freed black communities terrorized by racist violence. This is the story of the Rosewood Massacre. Following the end of the American Civil War, around 4 million African slaves had existed in the country. Many were eager to capitalize on their newly found freedom. However, this was not to be the case. Many whites in the southern states had no intentions on letting blacks have the same access to equal services as whites. In the American South, and later in other parts of the country, white lawmakers passed restrictive laws known as black codes to inhibit black growth and severe penalties for minor infractions, least of which involve associating with white women. During this period, one of the ways white lawmakers held up white supremacy was keeping the various races separate and not permitting miscegenation, commonly known as interracial relationships. While these laws first existed around the 1700s, it wasn't until around the turn of the 19th, 20th century that severe penalties were enacted for violating the racial social norm. Racist whites wanted to prevent interracial marriage in order to keep their race pure, and also that the belief that children of such marriages would be mentally inept in society. Despite these laws, some interracial unions did occur, albeit in very few numbers or in deep secret. Blacks could be violently beaten or lynched for rather simple offenses such as petty theft, vagrancy, or using disrespectful language when communicating with whites. Florida had a disproportionately large amount of lynchings during the 1920s leading up to the incident at Rosewood. Despite the vicious racist attitudes of the time, many blacks found ways to survive and thrive in the United States. With whatever freedom and money they had, many free blacks established small, self-reliant towns across the South. These communities provided jobs and income for their citizens, provided land for growing food, and cultural institutions such as schools and churches to preserve their cultural identity. Many of these communities could be governed autonomously and relied little on the outside help. Soon, vibrant communities such as Rosewood in Florida and Tulsa in Oklahoma sprang up across the country. In these communities, blacks could associate with other blacks and make a living without fear of oppression and racial violence. Rosewood was founded in 1847 as an outpost for a lumber mill. The hamlet had around 200 people at the time and had both black and white residences. Eventually, many of the whites moved away and Rosewood would become a mostly black town. In other parts of the country, lynchings and racial violence was common, both in the South and even in the North. Some whites began to resent the flourishing black settlements, fearing competition with white companies and communities. Following the end of the First World War, many black veterans, having weapons and combat experience, began returning back to the U.S. There was also fears of blacks and whites intermingling, particularly in a sexual manner. This, along with returning armed black men, stoked fears in the minds of many Southern whites. In the mid-1920s, the terrorist group known as the Ku Klux Klan had record numbers across the country, and particularly the American South. By 1923, Rosewood had a population of around 200 people and mostly black, with the exception of a white family that owned a general store in the area. On January 1, 1923, Fannie Taylor, a white woman from the nearby hamlet of Sumner, claimed that she had been attacked by a black man. She later told her husband, James Taylor, and it wasn't long before the white residences became enraged by this news. Local law enforcement postulated that a black prisoner named Jesse Hunter had committed the crime and was hiding among the black residences of Rosewood. After hearing the news of what happened to Fannie Taylor, an angry mob of white men began to assemble and march towards Rosewood. Meanwhile, a black laborer named Sam Carter was kidnapped, tortured, and lynched on January 2nd. This was in retaliation for an assumption that Carter had helped Jesse Hunter escape. Noting the rising tensions in the community, many black residents began to arm themselves. On the night of January 4th, the white mob gathered at the home of Sylvester Carrier. The mob had assumed that Carrier, too, was harboring Hunter. A scuffle ensued and eventually shots were fired, killing an elderly black woman. Then, both sides exchanged fire, with deaths on both sides. Surprised by black resistance, the white mob retreated but returned in greater numbers. Then, on the 5th of January, a mob of around 300 whites attacked Rosewood. Much of the homes, businesses, and other buildings were destroyed and around 40 blacks were killed. The rest of the population either fled into a nearby forest or stowed away on a train to Gainesville, Florida. The massacre in Rosewood is one in a countless list of racial massacres that occurred throughout the United States, particularly in the American South. Just several years prior, in November of 1920, a racial massacre happened in the small Florida town of Ocoee, in which 30 black citizens were killed during an attempt to vote. Despite the brutality of both massacres, very little was known about both tragedies. Many Rosewood residences would never discuss in public the tragedy with others, but in 1994, the state of Florida paid reparations to the last remaining survivors of the Rosewood Massacre, an entitlement settlement of $150,000 per resident. In 1997, African-American filmmaker John Singleton produced a film entitled Rosewood about the massacre. Fannie Taylor, the white woman who had accused a black man of rape, would admit later that she had fabricated the rape story in order to cover up an affair with a white man she had been seeing in secret. Very little of Rosewood remains today, but the site is marked by a historical marker.